Some stories end with applause, with tears of joy, with people gathering around a hospital bed saying, "You did it, you made it." Mine didn't. Mine ended with a quiet beep from a monitor, a doctor's soft nod, and a nurse whispering, "You're stable now." And then, nothing. No footsteps rushing in. No phone lighting up. No arms around my shoulders saying they were glad I was still here. I survived stage 4 cancer. But I did not survive the silence that followed. It's strange, the way life gives you the biggest fight of your existence, and then hands you an empty room when it's finally over. You think the battle ends when the chemo drips stop, when the scans turn clear, when the doctor finally uses the word remission. But the truth, the part no one warns you about, is that the loneliest moments come after you survive. I remember lying in that hospital bed, long after the danger had passed, listening to the distant chatter of families celebrating in the hallway. Someone had brought balloons. Someone else had flowers. I heard laughter spill into the corridor, laughter loud enough that I could almost pretend it belonged to me. But my door stayed closed. My room stayed dim. And the only flowers near me were the fading ones a nurse had left on my table because someone should. Before cancer, my life wasn't extraordinary, but it was full. I had my routines, my people, my small joys. I had Sunday calls from my son, short, rushed, but still something. I had neighbors who waved when I walked out to get the mail. I had a kitchen that smelled like coffee and memories. I didn't have much, but I wasn't alone. And then the diagnosis came. It shook me, of course. Not because I feared death, I've lived long enough to make some peace with that, but because suddenly everyone looked at me differently. Like I was fragile glass. Like I was a fading photograph. Like I had already stepped halfway into the next world. My son, busy with his life, promised he'd fly in soon. Soon never came. Friends sent quick messages, little digital postcards saying, "You've got this," before they went back to their own storms. It wasn't their fault. Illness makes people uncomfortable. It reminds them that life is not promised, not even tomorrow. And when people are afraid, they step back. So I went through chemo mostly alone. I lost my hair alone. I vomited into cold plastic buckets alone. I watched the seasons change through a hospital window, leaves turning from green to gold to bare branches, all in silence. But I fought. Because that's what we do, those of us who have lived long enough to know the price of giving up. We fight quietly. We fight gently. We fight without witnesses. And somehow I made it. I remember the oncologist's words, spoken carefully, almost softly, "Your scans look good. You're in remission." I nodded, as though he had just told me the weather report. He waited, maybe expecting tears or celebration. But how could I celebrate when there was no one waiting out in the hall? When there was no voice I could call that wouldn't say, "Oh, that's wonderful," before rushing back to whatever they were doing? Survival feels different when no one is holding your hand. They discharged me 2 days later. I stepped outside into the bright sun, and felt this strange emptiness open inside me. Not fear, not sadness, but something deeper. Something like standing in an open field, calling out, and hearing your own voice echo back. At home, everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar. My chair. My kitchen. My quiet hallway. It all felt like a museum, rooms filled with the ghosts of the life I used to have. I set down the discharge papers on the counter and realized no one would ask to see them. No one would say, "Let me make you some soup." No one would insist on staying the night, just to be safe. I sat on the edge of my bed and let the silence settle around me. It felt heavy. Thicker than the chemo fog. Softer than the hospital blankets. More painful than the cancer itself. People think the hardest part of illness is the treatments, the fear, the scans, the side effects. But the truth, at least the truth I learned, is that the hardest part is coming home to a world that doesn't even notice you walked back into it. The phone stayed quiet. Days passed. My son didn't call. I kept telling myself he must be busy. Work must be stressful. Life must be happening. But there is a specific kind of loneliness that seniors carry, the kind no one talks about. The kind that builds slowly like dust on a forgotten picture frame. It's the loneliness of waiting for a call that doesn't come. Waiting for footsteps that never approach your door. Waiting for someone to remember that you survived something huge, something terrifying, something that could have taken you away forever. I thought the cancer would break me. But it was the silence afterward that did. Every morning I would sit at the table with my cup of tea, watching the steam rise, thinking how strange it was that I could survive something doctors weren't sure I'd make it through, yet I couldn't survive the quiet ache of being uncelebrated, unseen, untouched. Sometimes I'd whisper into the empty room, "I'm still here, you know." Just to hear a voice, any voice, acknowledge my existence. I started talking to the old photographs on my walls. The ones from when life was louder, messier, full of arguments and laughter and burnt dinners and holidays with too many people squeezed into too small a living room. Back when being alive meant something to someone. Some nights, when the house felt too big, I'd sleep with the lamp on. Not because I was scared of the dark, but because I was scared of disappearing into it. They don't tell you that surviving cancer also means surviving the aftermath, the quiet, the distance, the way people assume you're fine now, even when your heart is still limping. I realized something one afternoon, sitting alone on the porch, watching the wind push through the trees. I had fought so hard to stay alive, but I had no one to live for anymore. And that kind of truth sits heavy on a soul. Still, in all that silence, something small began to grow. A whisper of a thought. A slow, gentle truth I had avoided for years. If no one else was going to hold my survival like something sacred, then maybe I would have to learn how to hold it myself. I didn't discover that truth all at once. It came to me slowly, the way dawn lifts itself over a sleeping town, quietly, almost shyly, touching one corner of your heart before softly reaching the next. It began with a single morning. I woke up before the sun, the house still wrapped in shadows. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea, listening to the old refrigerator hum. For a moment, a small one, I realized I wasn't as afraid of the silence as I had been the day before. It still hurt, yes, but it didn't swallow me whole. I noticed the light fall through the window and settle on the steam rising from my cup. Something about that moment felt gentle, almost comforting. Like life was trying to tell me, you're still here. Sit with this. I didn't know it then, but that tiny sliver of peace was the beginning of something larger. Still, loneliness was not done teaching me. Some afternoons, the quiet would press against my chest so heavily that I'd find myself pacing the hallway with no destination. I'd open the same cabinets, stare at the same shelves, just searching for something, anything, that reminded me I was alive. Other days, I'd sit on the edge of the bed and cry without sound. Not dramatic tears, just soft ones. The kind that fall because the heart needs to loosen its own knots. And always there was the phone. I'd keep it nearby, turned up loud just in case. I'd check the battery twice, clean the screen, leave it face up where I could see it. I told myself I wasn't waiting for anyone in particular, but that was a lie. I was waiting for my son. Waiting for him to say the words I needed so badly to hear. I'm proud of you. I'm glad you're alive. But the silence stretched on. And in that silence, memories visited me. I remembered holding him as a baby, his tiny hand wrapped around my thumb like I was his entire world. I remembered sitting in the bleachers at his games, cheering until my voice cracked, even when he barely looked my way. I remembered Christmas mornings when his excitement filled the house with something like thunder. Back then, love felt like noise, messy, loud, full of life. Now it felt like the soft creak of an empty hallway. There were days it felt unfair. Days I whispered into the still air, how did we end up like this? When did we drift so far apart? But life doesn't give you one big heartbreak. It gives you tiny ones, spread over years, until one morning you wake up and realize the distance between you and someone you love is no longer measured in miles, but in memories. One evening, as dusk settled, I pulled out an old blanket I had crocheted decades ago. Back when my hands were steadier, back when my eyesight didn't tire so easily. The yarn was frayed in places, uneven in others. I ran my fingers over it, tracing the mistakes, the missed loops, the places where the colors didn't quite match. And somehow, that made it beautiful. It reminded me that life is made of imperfect things. Missed calls, strained relationships, the gaps between us and the people we love. But it's also made of effort, of trying, of the quiet ways we show up even when nobody notices. Holding that blanket, I realized I had spent so much of my life giving warmth to others, and so little giving any to myself. So the next day I did something small. Something almost embarrassingly ordinary. I made myself a proper breakfast. Not toast. Not tea and a biscuit. A real breakfast, eggs, fruit, warm bread. I set the table, placed everything neatly the way I used to when my husband was alive. I even put a little vase of flowers beside my plate. It felt strange at first. Indulgent. Like celebrating a birthday no one remembered. But when I sat down and took the first bite, something inside me settled. Not healed, not fixed, but softened. As though a voice whispered, you deserve this. You deserve care, even if you're the only one giving it. That morning didn't erase the loneliness. It didn't magically fill my phone with calls or my doorstep with visitors. But it reminded me that silence doesn't always mean emptiness. Sometimes it is space. Space life leaves for you to rediscover yourself. Still, the nights were the hardest. I'd lie in bed listening to the house breathe, every creak a reminder of how long it had been since laughter lived here. I'd turn on the lamp, watch its glow wash over the room, and think about how many times that light had guided me through darker chapters. I wasn't afraid of dying anymore. I was afraid of fading, of living a life no one remembered, no one celebrated, no one cherished. And yet, beneath all the fear, there was a small, stubborn ember inside me. An ember that refused to go out. Maybe it came from surviving cancer. Maybe it came from all the years life pushed me down and I stood back up anyway. Whatever it was, it told me this. You are still here. Your story is not finished. And silence is not the end. One afternoon, when the loneliness felt heavier than usual, I went for a slow walk down the street. My legs were weaker than they used to be and the sun felt too bright, but something pulled me out the door. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was hope. The wind brushed my face gently, the kind of touch I hadn't felt in months. Leaves rustled overhead like they were whispering secrets to one another. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. Somewhere a child laughed. Life. Ordinary everyday life. Life that didn't depend on my son calling, or on someone congratulating me for surviving. For the first time I realized the world still had room for me. It hadn't closed its door. It was still moving, still breathing, still offering small moments of grace, if I was willing to see them. When I got home I sat on the porch steps and let the breeze cool the ache in my chest. And I thought very quietly, maybe I can survive this silence too. Maybe I don't have to fear it. Maybe I can learn to live beside it. And that thought, that tiny thought, was the beginning of my healing. The healing wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no triumphant music, no sudden breakthrough, no magical moment where everything made sense. It came the way seasons change, so slowly that you only notice it in hindsight. I began to speak to myself kindly. Not out loud at first, but in the quiet places of my mind. You made it through another morning. You're doing your best. You matter even if no one says it. Simple, soft words. The kind I had spent a lifetime offering others but had never learned to offer myself. Some days I'd still wake up with a knot in my stomach, the kind of knot loneliness ties without permission. On those mornings I'd sit by the window, let the light fall on my face, and breathe slowly until the tightness loosened its grip. Other days I'd find myself staring at the phone again, waiting for a message that never came. I'd tell myself I didn't care, but the truth is, we never stop caring about the people we love, even when they forget to love us back. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in tired shades of gold, I picked up my old photo album, the one with the stiff leather cover and fading corners. Inside were decades of memories. Birthdays, scraped knees, graduations, ordinary afternoons that had felt unimportant at the time but now felt like treasures. As I turned each page I didn't feel sadness. I felt gratitude. Those moments may have passed, but they were mine. My laughter. My stories. My joys. My efforts. My love. Cancer had taken my strength. Silence had taken my certainty. But nothing, not illness, not age, not loneliness, could take away the life I had lived. And in that gentle realization, something inside me shifted. The silence in the house no longer sounded hostile. It sounded almost spacious, like a room waiting to be filled with something new, something mine. So I began doing little things that made the days feel less empty. I placed a chair outside by the garden and started watching the birds each morning, admiring how boldly they sang even though no one was clapping for them. I cooked meals that reminded me of my mother, the warm spices, the slow simmering pots, the kind of food that made the house smell like memory. I read old poetry books, letting the words wash over me like warm water, reminding me that even centuries ago, people felt what I feel now. I took slow walks, greeting strangers with small smiles, grateful for even the briefest acknowledgement. And most importantly, I let myself feel proud of surviving. Because survival, I realized, doesn't need an audience. It is sacred even when witnessed by no one. It is triumph, even when celebrated in silence. Still, there was one thing I hadn't yet faced. The lingering ache of my son's absence. It weighed on me not because I expected him to become someone he wasn't, but because I needed to understand why his distance hurt so deeply. So one night, sitting alone with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, I let the truth rise gently inside me. I wasn't grieving my son. I was grieving the version of him I had imagined. The son who would show up, who would sit at my bedside, who would say, "I'm proud of you," who would celebrate my survival as though it mattered. But children grow and life pulls them away. And sometimes the growing takes them so far that they forget where they started. It doesn't mean they don't love us. It means they're living in storms we cannot see. Once I understood that, my heart loosened its grip around the hurt. I didn't forgive him all at once. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a door you crack open. A little at a time. Only as much as you're ready for. A few mornings later, while I was watering the small plant on my windowsill, I did something I hadn't done in months. I smiled. A quiet, private smile. Not because someone called. Not because life became suddenly easy. But because I realized something deeply, beautifully true. I had survived more than cancer. I had survived abandonment. I had survived long, empty nights. I had survived a world that forgot to check in on me. And I was still here. Still breathing. Still learning. Still capable of soft, quiet joy. Loneliness hadn't defeated me. It had shaped me into someone gentler, someone wiser, someone who knew the value of small things. The next time I stepped outside, the morning air felt different. Not brighter, not warmer, not miraculous. Just welcoming. Like the world had made room for me again. As I walked down the street, trailing my fingertips along the hedges lining the sidewalk, I thought about how close I had come to disappearing inside my own silence. And how miraculous it was that, even alone, I had chosen to keep living. Not surviving, living. And that's when the real truth settled softly into my heart. The people who don't show up are not the measure of our worth. We are more than the calls that never came. We are more than the chairs left empty around our table. We are more than the silence that follows our victories. Our existence, our survival, our story, is enough. There came a morning, a quiet, ordinary one, when I finally understood the difference between loneliness and aloneness. Loneliness is an ache, a hollow space, a hunger for voices, for touch, for someone to say your name with warmth. But aloneness can be peaceful. Aloneness can be a soft room where you can finally hear your own heartbeat. Aloneness can be freedom from waiting for doors that will never open. That morning, I stepped outside with my cup of tea and sat on the porch steps. The wood was cool beneath me, the sky pale with the first traces of dawn. A thin, silver light touched the fence, the leaves, my hands. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something like companionship, even if it came from the world itself. I watched a single bird land on the railing, its tiny chest rising and falling as it sang a note meant for no one in particular. It sang because that's what it was born to do. Not for applause. Not for an audience. Not for celebration. Just because. And I thought to myself, what if that could be me? What if survival didn't need witnesses? What if healing didn't need validation? What if simply breathing, simply being, simply continuing, was a victory all its own? That thought brought me a strange, unexpected peace. The kind you only feel after walking through a storm and realizing you're still standing. Later that day, I found myself sorting through the small, unglamorous pieces of my life. Old grocery lists tucked into drawers, receipts from decades-old purchases, a scarf my husband once complimented, a birthday card with no signature, left over from a time when people still bothered to send them. I held each item gently, acknowledging what it represented. A life lived. A life noticed, even if only by me. A life filled with moments that mattered, even if no one else remembers them. And as I placed these items back into their drawers, I realized something I had never allowed myself to believe. Being remembered is a blessing. But being alive is the miracle. Surviving stage 4 cancer taught me many things. About strength, about fragility, about the way the body can bend without breaking. But surviving the silence afterward taught me something even more valuable. The world does not shrink just because people drift away. Life does not lose its meaning just because others forget to witness it. We do not stop maturing just because we age into the quieter chapters of our story. And slowly, very slowly, the world began to reflect that truth back to me. A neighbor waved longer than usual one afternoon, asking how I'd been. A cashier smiled and commented on the color of my scarf. A child riding a bicycle shouted, "Hi," as he passed my yard. The mailman paused to tell me the weather would be kind tomorrow. Tiny moments. Small gestures. Easy to overlook, unless you've lived through the kind of silence where even a single greeting feels like a gift. These small threads began stitching themselves into my days, weaving a different kind of companionship. Not the big, sweeping kind I used to crave, but a gentle, quiet connection to the world around me. And with every soft interaction, I learned a little more about how to live again. One evening, I sat in my favorite chair, an old, worn recliner, and allowed myself to reflect on the long journey behind me. The treatments, the fear, the cold hospital nights, the hollow silence that followed, the ache of being forgotten, the slow rebuilding of a life that no longer depended on anyone else's recognition. And as I looked back, I realized something profound. I had survived not because someone held my hand, but because I refused to let go of myself. There is a strength that grows in the dark, A strength born from conversations with your own soul, from tears you wipe alone, from tiny decisions to keep going even when no one notices. I had found that strength, nurtured it, lived by it, and now it lives in every breath I take. Sometimes the phone still stays silent for days. Sometimes I still wish my son would call. Sometimes I still feel that old ache rise up when I pass the empty chair across from mine. But now, I don't crumble under it. I let it pass through me like wind through a quiet room. I feel it, honor it, and then allow it to drift away. Because I finally understand. The silence that once felt like abandonment has become the space where I learn to cherish myself. And in that space I am not lonely. I am growing. I am rebuilding. I am gently, quietly alive. There is a line I whisper to myself now, especially on the nights when the house feels too still. You survived cancer. You can survive this too. And I do. Every day. In small, meaningful ways. So if you're listening to my story, if you're sitting there with your own kind of silence pressing against your chest, let me tell you this with all the softness and honesty I have. You matter. Not because someone calls. Not because someone visits. Not because someone celebrates you. You matter because you have lived. Because you have loved. Because you have survived things that would have broken others. Because your heart still hopes, still tries, still wakes up each morning wanting to belong to this world. And that is enough. If my voice has found you tonight, if these words feel like they were written for you, then take this as the reminder you may have been waiting for. Your story is not done. Your presence still counts. Your existence still echoes. And even in the quietest moments, especially in the quietest moments, your life has meaning. If this touched your heart, share it with someone who may need to be reminded that their story matters too. Because even at our age, we are still here. And we still matter.